Hi, I'm Theron Pummer. I'm a philosopher here at St. Andrews and the director of the Center for Ethics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs, or CEPPA. And today I have the privilege of speaking with Professor Roger Crisp of Oxford. Roger is Professor of Moral Philosophy at Oxford University and Uhiro Fellow and Tutor at St. Anne's College, as well as a Professorial Fellow at the Australian Catholic University. Roger has written widely in ethics, pretty much covering every subfield: meta-ethics, normative ethics, practical ethics, history of ethics. And today, I'll be speaking with Roger about the case for open borders. I guess a lot of people would say that it's perfectly justifiable that countries have their own national borders, and a really natural thought here is that just like I can put up a fence around my own property because it's mine, a country can surely put up a border and regulate it to protect their own property. Do you think that's a good justification of national borders?
Not really. I think one distinction to begin with is that between law and morality. So it's clear that according to UK law, in standard cases, people own their own property. But what we're talking about is whether they have moral rights to the property. And there might well be cases when somebody has a legal right to a property, but in fact we think morally they don't have a right to it. For example, if they stole it from somebody else, but that hasn't yet been noticed. And I think what that shows is that property is by its nature what we might call a diachronic notion. It's a historical notion. So a property right, a moral property right, is a right which gives other people a duty to refrain from taking something to which you claim to have the property right. So then the question is, why do people own their own property in the first place from the moral point of view? How did it all start? There was a time, long ago, when there was no property, nobody owned anything because there weren't any people. So between that time and now, these alleged moral property rights came into being, and we need to ask how that happened. We need to ask how property was acquired in the first place. And the standard theory, which is now accepted by many philosophers and has entered to some extent common sense or everyday consciousness, is the Lockean theory. The idea that you acquire property, particularly property rights in land, by mixing your labour with that land. So to use an analogue of your example, somebody goes to some piece of land which has no other people on it, never has had other people on it, and they plough it, plant seeds on it, and take the crop. Most people would say they were entitled to the crop, and many people would say they were entitled to fence that land off and stop other people coming in, given that it's been cleared for growing crops and so on the condition, as Locke said, that there's still plenty of land left for other people. Now this theory sounds all well and good, but in practice it's hard to see how it's meant to work. So for example, why do we say that the person is entitled to put up the fence? Why are they not just entitled to the seed that they've grown? What if there are people who would love to plant seeds and grow crops, but they're unable to because they're disabled in some way? It seems unfair that those people are not given an opportunity. And I think one thing that often happens, and happened in Locke's philosophy, and the late Jerry Cohen was very good at pointing this out, I think, is that we tend to think people have a right to their own bodies and their own talents, which are somehow inherent in the body, and somehow those rights are transferred to the world when they work on the world. So Locke used to talk about people mixing their labour with the world, and this is problematic. So if we take an example from Robert Nozick, why shouldn't I make some ink and pour it into the Atlantic Ocean and say I've mixed my labour with the whole of the Atlantic Ocean? it's just not clear how this mysterious idea of mixing one's labour is meant to work. So I think there are real problems with the Lockean theory of acquisition.
Right, that's interesting. So do you think that the Lockean theory is implausible in itself, or it's just implausible in its application?
Both. And I've given some reasons for thinking it's implausible in itself. But let's assume that it's correct. Let's assume that at some point people justifiably acquired property in the world. That would have been a long time ago. So for property to be justly acquired now, it must be the case not only that it was acquired justly, but that it was transferred justly over time. For example, through gift or inheritance. And we know, it's just a plain fact, that the history of the world is a history of theft, if one accepts the Lockean theory of property. So now it's completely unclear who owns what, or if anybody owns what, especially when we take into account the fact that the people who now exist would not have existed anyway had it not been for all the thefts of property on a huge scale during history to our present point.
So do you think that there are plausible theories of property rights, and if so, how do you see those applying to the question of the justification of national borders?
Well, I think it helps to think a bit about how the institution of property emerged. How was it that people started thinking about property? And I think the answer is, it's a valuable idea. So groups which invented the idea of property would have done better because it's a useful notion to have. It helps coordinate, it provides some kind of incentive and so on. And I take it that people, or our ancestors, were territorial before they developed morality. So they just, they would have fought away intruders onto their land as they saw it, just for the survival of the group. But then as morality developed, the institution of property itself became moralised, so people started thinking that it was wrong, morally wrong, for other people to take their property. And that's, I think, where we went wrong. It's not wrong to take somebody else's property. It can be, but it's not in itself wrong. Property is a tool. It can be very helpful, but it's also been horribly misused over the history of humanity, which has brought us to the present day with these huge inequalities of wealth, particularly across different nations, but also within nations as well. Property is useful, but it's being wasted on a huge scale at the moment because it's not being employed to benefit people to anywhere near the extent to which it's possible to benefit them.
Do you think that there are views that are sort of in between the two that you mentioned, the Lockean view on the one hand and the view that property is useful but not intrinsically important, as it were, on the other hand, that would speak one way or the other on the question of the justification of borders?
Yeah, I think so. So, broadly speaking, the utilitarian tradition is the one I had in mind when I was talking about the usefulness of property. And most utilitarians have said over the centuries, look, don't go around trying to put utilitarianism into practice because we already have many useful notions within our everyday accepted morality, which it would be a mistake to get rid of. And I think that is the same with property. I don't think we have to go around changing our ideas about property. So, I don't have constantly to be thinking, well, I'd like to be able to use this bicycle to get home tonight, but it doesn't really belong to me. So will it maximise utility if I use them? I think what utilitarians would advise is that we moderate our common sense morality, the one we've been brought up with, in the light of the utilitarian principle, gradually. And that would mean certainly a greater, a fairer distribution of property across the world.
So if we go with the Lockean view, that ends up having problems of applicability in a way that could help us justify national borders. And the utilitarian view, and other views, I take it as well, would also fail to supply a plausible justification of national borders. What if we try some other type of justification besides one based on property? Couldn't somebody say that the real reason for having borders is that they help with social cohesion within a given country?
Yeah, that is an interesting argument. Again, it sounds to me like an argument which is heading in the direction of a broadly utilitarian position. If we understand utilitarianism as a view which puts first how well the lives of individuals go for them, there's nothing valuable about social cohesion in itself. It's another tool. Societies which are socially cohesive often do better than societies which are not. They benefit the individuals that inhabit them. But then we have to realise that those individuals will not be the only individuals in the world. So we have to balance the benefit of social cohesion against the benefit that will come from immigrants to some country, even if they threaten social cohesion. Okay, so there's an empirical question about whether immigration does threaten social cohesion. On the face of it, it's not obvious why it should. But if it was starting to look likely that it would threaten social cohesion to some extent, that's not a knockdown argument against allowing immigration, because the immigrants themselves may be in desperate need, and their needs, including the needs for social cohesion of their own, would counterbalance the needs of the existing inhabitants for social cohesion.
So it sounds like the kind of response that you just gave involves a comparison of benefits to different individuals and thinking about the value of social cohesion in terms of the benefit to particular individuals. Suppose someone might say that there's something valuable about a country having a particular culture that does benefit individuals, but it's valuable above and beyond any benefits to any particular individuals. Do you think that that might provide a response to you that could in turn help us justify borders that would put limits on the number of immigrants that could come in if their coming in threatened the value of the culture as such?
Yeah. Well, again, I agree that can be claimed, but I think the best interpretation of the value of culture is individualistic. People benefit in all sorts of ways through being brought up within a particular culture and engaging in it through their lives. And that is something that it's worth retaining. But that's just one good among others. And again, we have to remember the fact that immigrants themselves have often lost the roots of their culture. So if one's really concerned about culture, one should allow them to rebuild their cultural communities rather than keeping them out.
So both of the responses you gave suggested a kind of impartial comparison between the benefits of members of a given country and individuals outside the country. And I suppose one type of defense of national borders or justification of national borders would appeal to a special relation between members of a country and their compatriots, and kind of like the special relation that friends have. I have special obligations, I take it, to my friends and others that are near and dear to me that I don't have to strangers. And it might be true that I also have special obligations to people that are my compatriots. One might then think that it's not a radical leap to a defense of national borders. After all, they protect my near and dear, my compatriots. What do you think of that type of argument?
Well, it is made quite often. And I think one mistake that it involves is thinking that all special relations are the same. So let's accept that people who are friends with one another have certain special obligations to one another. In other words, they have to give the friend's interests some priority over the interests of non-friends.
Mm-hmm.
I am not friends with all other UK citizens, nor could I be. So the relationship I have with them must be quite different. It must be a non-personal relationship. The only relationship I have is in fact the very relationship of citizenship itself. So there's a sort of bootstrapping element in the argument here, because there is no analogue for the personal relationship that I have with my friends.
Do you think it's different if we're talking about the obligations of politicians? I mean, they were voted in by their constituents, and Nicola Sturgeon, for example, might have special obligations to the Scottish. Do you think that even if individuals don't have special obligations to their compatriots, politicians nonetheless do, and that they could then defend national borders on that basis?
Well, my own view is that morality is impartial, so that nobody has any special obligations to anybody else. That's not to say that we shouldn't go along with a lot of common sense morality which involves special obligations, but that's for reasons which themselves can be seen to be justified from an impartial point of view. Now, how should Nicola Sturgeon think? Well, it depends on the scenario. If everybody in Scotland or everybody in the world becomes convinced of impartial morality, then they would probably accept that she shouldn't be giving them any priority. But the fact is, that's very unlikely. So we're now imagining a situation in which most people think that Nicola Sturgeon has some special obligations to them, but let's say she becomes persuaded of the impartial point of view. How should she behave? Well, clearly she's got to take into account the effects of her actions on others. And if she starts behaving in a way that many people see as excessively impartial, that would presumably lead to her being voted out, as well as all sorts of other problems. So I think it's a delicate balance for politicians, but they shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that the people that voted for them or the people that live in their own country are any more significant than anybody else.
This relates to another thing I wanted to ask you, which is basically, if you're right about the case for open borders, what should we do in the next few days, weeks, months, years? What's the immediate practical implication of your view? And relatedly, is there a difference between a view that says we ought to have open borders and a view that just says there shouldn't be any national borders at all? Because we've gone through different possible justifications of any borders at all, and at each point you've expressed skepticism about that case. So is it open borders or is it no borders?
Well, again, I think it depends on the scenario we're imagining. So if you imagine a very distant possible world in which everybody's come around to my point of view, they all believe that morality is impartial, and they all believe that they have certain fairly stringent duties to help other people, then even then, I suspect it would be a mistake to open up borders immediately, because it would lead to all sorts of confusion which could be avoided. But I can imagine that in a relatively short period, a world government could be developed and borders would become a thing of the past. A more realistic scenario might be one in which the powerful members of a certain government become persuaded the impartial point of view. But again, they know that the people that live in the country in question don't accept it. Then I think their duty should be to try to persuade people to be as humane as possible when it comes to policy on immigration, particularly when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers. So that would mean in the UK, for example, going in a direction very different from the one that unfortunately our own politicians have been taking over the last 10 to 15 years.
Thanks very much for taking the time to talk to me today, Roger. I really enjoyed that.
Thanks, Theron. It's always a pleasure.
And thanks to you for joining us.